So I left off talking a bit about the Knights of Labor, and I've mentioned 1886 in particular. I want to talk now in this segment about the so-called Haymarket Riots and their effect on this sort of fledgling effort to organize labor in response to what's happening with the new economy, including, of course, unemployment as people lose jobs to the increased use of machinery and to mass production techniques and management techniques covering time and efficiency. Before I get to Haymarket, though, let me drop back in time just a bit and give you a little bit more information about the major rail strike that occurred in 1877. Predominantly, it was focused around July of that year, July 1877, and it was caused when a series of wage cuts and earlier strike efforts had failed, when wage cuts had been imposed, and it led ultimately to violence all along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. In fact, ultimately including 3 different railroad routes covering everything from Pennsylvania to Ohio, including West Virginia. Over the course of this strike, it lasted about a month, I guess, over the course of this strike, rioters destroyed millions of dollars in railroad property. They derailed trains, they tore up track, they offloaded locomotives, they made sure that products couldn't get through. It's kind of notable that many towns along the route, they were aided by family and by friends and by sympathizers, but they certainly were not sympathized with by railroad officials, by many locals along the rails who'd come to depend upon railroad service, and ultimately by the federal government. Just to kind of give you the brief version of this, the state of West Virginia and Pennsylvania, other states, ultimately they'll call in state militia to try and deal with this problem. And the militias will battle strikers for about a month. But it really falls ultimately to the federal government. And it's here that a precedent is set, and that's really what I want to focus on. It's the precedent of using troops to sort of maintain this notion of law and order. It's not to say there weren't acts of violence taking place, but the question to be asked really was when, under what circumstances, and for whose interest should the federal government intervene if it should intervene? And the choice was made by Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877 to intervene with federal troops to stop the strike in that particular year, 1877. That sets a precedent. And it's something we see over and over and over again from 1877 through Haymarket, but even beyond, out west in Colorado, but also in places like Harlan County, Kentucky, in the coal fields of Appalachia, but also in the textile mill villages of the American South or New England. It's the common use of government force or enforcement powers to stop the collective action of labor. Well, at Haymarket in 1886, and by Haymarket I mean Haymarket Square in Chicago, Illinois, the Knights of Labor, by that point, 1886, had reached basically the height of their strength, of their numbers. May 1st, 1886 was to be a day of mass strikes and a huge labor demonstration in Haymarket Square. And to give you some context for why this day had been set aside and why workers were so upset, about 610,000 workers were out of work because of lockouts, strikes, or shutdowns. In other words, this striking, this resistance to the changes underway in America's factories and America's economy, to being the underclass, this resistance was beginning to take form, not just along the Baltimore, Ohio, but across the nation. It's worth noting that among the demonstrators in Haymarket Square were to be anarchists, radicals, oftentimes associated with the immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe who were supposed to have espoused these radical ideas. Anarchism, or these so-called anarchists, were radicals who advocated the violent overthrow of authority. They're often associated with bomb throwing. They want to explode authority of any kind, any shape, any form. Well, police mobilized to prevent disorder at the Haymarket Square as these demonstrations were taking place. And they were especially concerned about workers at the great McCormick Reaper plant there, which major employer in Chicago, as the plains had opened up and as reapers to gather in wheat became more and more desirable out on the plains and out in the Midwest. Well, on May the 3rd, as demonstrations continued, police broke up a battle between unionists and strike breakers at the McCormick plant. In that incident, 2 unionists were killed and several were wounded. The next evening, demonstrations were again going on, this time against the brutality of the previous evening. And as a company of policemen approached the crowd who was protesting the violence of the previous night, probably anarchists threw bombs. At least a bomb or bombs exploded. What followed were mass arrests. 8 anarchists were tried and convicted for the deaths that occurred as a result. 4 of these individuals were executed. 1 committed suicide in prison. But the events at the Haymarket Square, the bombings, the explosions, the violence, the battles, drew attention to the labor unrest that was happening across the United States. And it engendered in the American public broadly, but particularly the middle class and the wealthy, a real fear of the potential revolutionary tendencies that labor organization might unleash. The result was a sort of backlash against labor organization, against collective bargaining, because it became associated with radicalism. And so one of the things I want you to try and understand, one of the things I'm getting at is that in American history, certainly by the late 19th century, but I would argue well before, there's very much a sort of triangle that occurs. All the pieces being interconnected, distinct, but interconnected. So that anytime we talk about labor, we must also consider ethnicity or race and how that then is tied into sort of radical ideas. How in the United States, many Americans, when they considered labor and the challenge that labor presented to ideas about progress and development, simply moved to the cultural understanding of labor as being tied to radical ideas like anarchism, socialism, communism, which is now moving through Europe. But how those ideas of radicalism are then bound up as well with, where did these folks come from? Who are they? Would a real American do these things? Would they believe these things? See, that's a question that I think Americans have always struggled with. What does it mean to be an American? Does it mean you have to be born here? Well, that's not quite enough, is it? Slaves were born on American soil, but it took an amendment to the United States Constitution to ensure them of citizenship. Can you be naturalized? Well, yes, in a sense. I mean, sure you can. You can come through Ellis Island. You can be naturalized. But as long as you're not from here and ethnicity is going to be allowed to play a role, then that ethnicity, for instance, being Italian or being Polish or, being Jewish, that ethnicity itself, those distinguishing cultural characteristics, may well be enough to have you tied in with the notion somehow you're a radical. Certainly, you come from a place that was infected with radical ideas. And all that, ethnicity, radical ideas, can then be tied to that third part of the triangle, the third element of the triad, which is labor, unions, and organization. It's not for me as a historian to tell you, what you should think, and I try not to do that as much as possible. But I would suggest to you that, at least as I understand it, this triad that I'm talking about is something you just can't ignore in American history. Whether labor overreached or underreached, not for me to say. But understand that when labor reached, they often felt the approbation of the American public, or certainly large elements of it, and a willingness of government to use force on the side not of labor, but the side of property and what they might have called law and order. After 1886, because the Knights of Labor, already espousing radical ideas, become associated with the violence of Haymarket Square and the unrest across the country, their numbers began to decline.